I'm Ujjwal Kumar, Associate Director at Guts International, and I'll be your MC today for this webinar. Uh, the agenda is first there will be a welcome address. I'm sorry to say that our General has to so the welcome address from Guts will be made by our Executive Director, Vipul Chatterjee, Vipul Chattopadhyay. And then the next message me that will take a few minutes for him to join, so we can begin with the welcome address. Mr. Chattopadhyay, the floor is yours.
I think we e-pharmacy title Unlocking Healthcare Access, the Regulatory Path Ahead for e-pharmacy. As Ujjwal has already mentioned, I am stepping into the shoes of Pradeep, as he has been called to an urgent meeting in the Foreign Ministry. From my experience of associating with the consumer movement for almost 3 decades, I can say with confidence that digitalization of economy has significantly benefited Indian consumers in almost all market segments, including e-pharmacy. The benefits are both in price and non-price terms. Of course, there are certain risks as well. Yet, digitalization is the way forward. In this context, let me begin with by saying that the flagship Ayushman Bharat digital doctors, hospitals, diagnostics, and pharmacies through an unified health interface, the whole ecosystem of access and quality of care, and most importantly, bridging the gap between urban and rural areas. In other words, the tyranny of distance is getting blurred, is getting reduced. And it also notes the presence of below par population doctor population pharmacy ratios. As I understand, it is a homegrown system which we have developed. Now there are media reports which says that the Indian government is considering a more ambitious Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission 2.0 over the next 5 years. In order to achieve the goal of universal health care, digitalization is the way forward for vast and diverse country like India. One of the main components of universal healthcare is ensuring that essential medicines reach the last mile, where the role of e-pharmacy becomes. Now, with this background, let me try to set the context. And broadly speaking, there are 4 issues which we are going to discuss today. First is e-pharmacy enhances accessibility, affordability, and it's a statement. We put it in a question form. This webinar, we are going to test this hypothesis. According to one estimate, around 20 crore billion Indians secure timely refill of life-saving medicines. This is despite the presence of over 8 lakh brick and mortar pharmacies in our country. Distance, transport cost, intermittent stockouts, and limited operating hours compound the problem of access to drugs. Now, looking at the increasing health burden due to chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension, access to pharma products is very critical. In this case, here, e-pharmacy becomes useful, leveraging digital platform, logistics network, and verification systems to deliver medicines directly at the patient's doors. E-pharmacies enhances accessibility and affordability of safe and quality drugs. It has almost become like a tautology. Accessibility by offering 24/7 ordering, while affordability increases because of lower prices and discounts. Facilitation of bulk procurement by e-pharmacy platforms and savings on logistical cost. Some platforms provide transparent price comparisons across brands and generics. E-pharmacies also enhance alerts to ensure legitimate, non-counterfeit supplies, secure, tamper-evident packaging, and cold chain logistics for temperature-sensitive drugs. AI-driven validation of uploaded digital prescription is also there. In diagnostic labs and e-pharmacy ecosystems, patients get end-to-end care that is more predictable, trackable, and patient-centric. Coming to the second point, while these benefits are all there are risks too, and how should we mitigate them? One of the major risks is the sale of prescription-only medicines without a valid prescription. If unchecked, such practices can lead to antibiotic resistance and adverse reactions, among others. Thus, there is a need to check this phenomenon in order to engender trust in online pharmacies. Technology, including AI, can play a major role to rectify this. Propagation of digital prescription with patient or doctor e-sign verification can check such practices. Similarly, use of blockchain and QR code-based traceability from manufacturer to consumer can help reduce the risk of spurious, substandard, or counterfeit drugs entering the system. In fact, offline traditional distribution chain is more to such risk. It is easier to catch the culprit using the digital trail in case of e-pharmacies. Since health data are sensitive personal data, there is also a risk of data security breach. Bigger the e-pharmacy platform, wider will be the effect of such breaches. This requires a robust and updated data security system being adopted by the e-pharmacy platforms, which can include end-to-end encryption and adoption of relevant ISO standards. Adherence to the Digital Personal Data Protection Act and regular third-party audit is necessary. By embedding these controls, e-pharmacies can uphold the highest standards of patient safety while scaling its reach. Coming to the third point, while benefits and risks are there, There is also regulatory deficit and policy uncertainty. Most of the concern raised with respect to e-pharmacy can be rectified by introducing suitable regulatory framework. At present, e-pharmacy is governed under general provisions of the Drug and Cosmetics Act 1940 and Pharmacy Act 1948, which were designed for traditional brick-and-mortar pharmacies. In 2018, draft rules under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act were notified, which provided the requirements and conditions for the sale of drugs by an e-pharmacy. However, same is yet to be finalized or enacted till now. Similarly, with the aim to overhaul the whole regime under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, in a draft bill, the Drugs, Medical Devices and Cosmetics Bill 2022 was issued for public comments by the government in July 2020. There has been no progress, unfortunately, on this as well. The regulatory deficit in e-pharmacy space not only pose policy uncertainty, having adverse effect on investment and innovation in this sector, but is also leading to conflicting interpretations by courts, further creating ambiguity. For instance, in 2018, Delhi High Court, in its interim or injunction order, stayed the sale of drugs without license by online pharmacy. In 2023, the same court, while dealing with a contempt application, had directed the center of the union government and the Delhi government to act against people selling pharmaceutical drugs online without a valid license. Another set of judgments came from the Madras High Court in 2019, where a single bench directed online traders to not proceed with online business in drugs and cosmetics till the draft rules on e-pharmacy of 2018 are notified. Now, upon appeal, the division bench of the Madras High Court stayed the order. Furthermore, during the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, the doorstep delivery of medicines was allowed by the notification. However, the draft technical advisory body is presently reviewing whether doorstep delivery of medicine should continue or not. Another area for regulatory improvement is interstate harmonization, which can standardize registration so that platforms can serve pan-India markets without multiple state approvals. Thus, the regulatory uncertainty with respect to e-pharmacy continues to adversely affecting confidence, particularly consumers' confidence in this sector. While FICCI has come out with self-regulation in the form of voluntary code of conduct for e-pharmacies in India, the same may not be enough. A balanced and modern regulatory framework is needed to provide clear direction and encourage responsible growth of e-pharmacy in India, which will further benefit the industry as well as the consumers. Now, coming to the fourth and final point, it is about collaboration with brick and mortar pharmacies. One of the issues that has been raised against the proliferation of e-pharmacies is the loss of livelihood due to phasing out of traditional pharmacies. The growth of e-pharmacies did not come at the expense of local pharmacies. A collaborative phygital combination of physical and digital model, where licensed neighborhood chemists fulfill last mile delivery for digital orders, can combine the trust and community connection of local outlets with the efficiency and traceability of technology. This approach preserves the role of the neighborhood pharmacist as a trusted advisor while giving them access to a wider inventory and logistical support. For patients, it means continuity of service, competitive pricing, and a familiar face to the For regulators, it provides a single, inspectable chain of custody that strengthens compliance without reducing access. Therefore, there will be a win-win situation for all stakeholders. Now, finally, let me conclude by saying that e-pharmacies represent a paradigm shift in how we can deliver medicines, especially in a country as vast and diverse as India. By harnessing digital innovation, forging partnerships with local chemists, and enacting clear, forward-looking regulations, we can ensure that every Indian, whether in urban high-rises or remote hamlets, has reliable, affordable, and safe access to essential medicines. With that, I look forward to, rather we look forward to a lively and outcome-oriented discussion today involving our expert panelists, which Ujjwal has already introduced. I hope Mr. Padmanabhan has joined. Yes, he has joined. The deliberation today will inform and guide our future research and advocacy efforts in this and related space. I thank you and hand over the reins of this webinar to the moderator of today, Mr. Padmanabhan. But before doing that, let me first thank Ujjwal for preparing an excellent speaking note. And the only thing which I found missing in this note is that perhaps keeping in mind the time constraint and space constraint is what is the experience of other countries like India in this space. So that is something which I'm sure that our panelists, they're going to throw some lights on. Thank you very much. On behalf of CUTS, on behalf of Mr. Mehta, Ujjwal and other colleagues, I welcome all of you once again. And over to Mr. Padmanabhan to take forward this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chattopadhyay. I think you have wonderfully set up the context ahead of us today. And welcome to all the panelists. I'm sorry I joined a little late. Apologies for that. And Ujjwal, thank you for the wonderful the build-up to today's conversation and helping me in going through the finer points for what we look to discuss today. So I won't take up too much time. I'll just jump straight into our conversation because I think after Mr. Chattopadhyay, I don't need to set any context. So the way we'll do it is we'll follow a bunch of rounds. And in the first round, I will request each of the panelists to go about 5 to 6 minutes each. And the theme at the first round that we look to address is looking at e-pharmacies as enablers of access, affordability, and safety, the key challenges the sector is facing today. Over to you. I think we can, no particular order, but we can go with Nirupama, Murali, and Leena. I'm just looking at my screen. It's easier. So over to you, Nirupama.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. So this is actually a very, very interesting topic per se, because e-pharmacies is something that is growing steadily now, especially in the context of the larger conversation around growth of e-commerce in the country. The Invest India website estimates that the sector for e-pharmacies is likely to be around 4.5 billion by 2025. They made this estimate in 2019, during which time they estimated it to be about 500 million USD, this is, and was at that time supposed to be only 2 to 3% of the entire pharmaceutical sales. But in 2025, they expected this to be 44%. Now, I don't have data readily available to see whether it has actually reached those projection levels or not, and I'd be very, very happy to see if anyone has that. I think from, starting with the general document that I have, which looks at basically to see why is it important in India's context. So we know healthcare has been a priority for us, accessible healthcare especially, and in terms of accessible both ways, in terms of making it affordable as well as accessible in terms of reach. And I think e-pharmacies is something that provides us that opportunity in terms of reach. Affordability comes at a later stage, but what it does do, much like anything around e-commerce, is it gives you access to services that may otherwise not be very easy to avail of. So whether it is in terms of certain kinds of people, certain age groups of people, or certain geographic distribution, I think it makes life easy for certainly a large part of the population to be able to buy medicines from places, access medicines through an online platform. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest advantages that are there. The second, of course, and based on Mr. Chattopadhyay's also introduction, a couple of things that I wanted to add. The second, of course, is this entire conversation that's been around whether the growth of e-pharmacies means the death of your traditional pharmacies or the smaller pharmacies. And I think this debate of whether online players will completely eat into the lives of the smaller traditional formats has happened in different contexts, particularly retail. Now, e-pharmacies is something which is going to be interesting, because we know when it came to your Kirana stores, whether it was the entry of organized retail or whether it's been the entry of e-commerce, the Kirana stores have managed to weather and compete well. But we do also know that the smaller businesses that probably went out were your mobile shops. We went to organized, or we switched to online platforms. Now, e-pharmacies, this is going to be very interesting for two reasons. One is that if indeed e-pharmacies bring in a certain level of price competitiveness over your regular pharmacies, your offline pharmacies, depending on margins, depending on what kind of flexibility there is, and servicing costs for the smaller people, it is quite possible that you will have, if not completely wiped out, a certain percentage may be left kind of out of business, so to speak. Now, that can be argued as normal when any kind of digital disruption happens. But this is something that one needs to take cognizance of and see how it works, especially in the context of the Invest India projection that 44% will belong to e-pharmacy. So from 2 to 3% to 44%, if we're going by those figures, however it is they estimated at that, which means that there is some kind of possibility of a sizable chunk of your offline pharmacies actually going out of business. I'm basing it on this. I don't know how it will work. The second part, which was more interesting, which Mr. Chattopadhyay brought out, and as a response to this, is actually in terms of hybrid models that can actually emerge. So hybrid models where platforms or marketplaces can source from your offline pharmacies and kind of supply them. Now, this is very interesting because this then goes quintessentially to what one calls as a marketplace model versus an inventory-based model for your regular e-commerce. So in the case of e-pharmacies, which are inventory-based, which means they have their own stock and they have their own inventory of medicines, and how possible that is or how plausible that is a separate conversation, then any kind of hybrid model doesn't always work. Now, but if you're looking at it as a marketplace model, it becomes a little more tricky, because then what you're doing is the other issues that one looks at continue, whether it is affordability, right? Because you're sourcing from your offline pharmacies, the prices will remain the same. If you're talking about quality and traceability, that too to some extent, while there is a track, but that too to some extent, those will also persist. So it's a question of seeing how, if you want to create hybrid models, but hybrid models that then kind of are able to ascend above your typical issues that we are claiming to be problems with your physical pharmacies, that e-pharmacies do away with. I think these two are important points. The third, of course, is looking at it from a larger point of view of a regulatory framework, which is basically the rules that are yet to come in. And my larger question, because I do a lot of work on e-commerce per se, but my larger quintessential question is, even I know the rules aren't here today, but even when the e-pharmacy draft rules are notified, 2018 rules, whenever they are, will they still be subject to the same rules and regulations of what has come under e-commerce? So whether it's under your consumer protection or whether it's under your FDI rules that are there. So how does that kind of fit in? And if it's going to, and if the draft rules for e-pharmacy is going to be plus on top of e-commerce, or is it a separate channel? Because that then creates a whole other level in terms of layer in terms of regulation. I'll stop here for now, but these are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupama. Over to you, Murali.
I think most of what I thought I would say have been covered by both Vipul and Nirupama, but I think I will try and raise the concerns that the offline retailers have, and then we'll think about how we can address some of those. One of the key issues relates to what the relationship between a consumer or a patient and the pharmacist is. In many communities, there aren't that many medical stores. Yes, it's true that we have high density areas and therefore we will have many medical stores in lots of urban areas. You will find multiple medical stores in the same street, maybe. But for large parts of the population, there may not be that medical store number of choice in the medical stores. So in the UK, for example, this became an issue, and the NHS thought about it very carefully about what they can do to build relationships between the pharmacist and the NHS patients. I think this is an issue which nobody seems to be looking at in India at all. What is the role of the pharmacist in the drugstore? I understand it's a real problem for India because most pharmacies don't have a pharmacist. And the licensing requirement for someone to own a pharmacy store and be stated as the person who is accountable for that pharmacy store is 10th pass. So that's low standard for building this relationship, which we hope we can somehow be influenced by the practices in the West. We see that in America as well, where if you forget the big cities, in more rural areas, the pharmacist relationship with that community is quite strong. So there may be a role for pharmacists in pharmacy stores to build these relationships with their customers. I don't think we're there yet, but this might be one of the value-added services that offline pharmacies and pharmacists in those offline pharmacies can deliver. I had a comment on the omni-channel approach. We've seen that in several other sectors as well. It is more nuanced than saying that if you have an offline store versus an online store, what happens? We've seen even pure online brands in the great days, they were called D2C, also becoming omni-channel. So they have the marketplace model, they have their own store in the marketplace, they have brick and mortar stores, and they have independent retailers. So we have a combination of these, and the supply chain has adapted to this reality. So I don't see a reason why you should have either a marketplace model or an inventory model. I see the reality of it being that we will have omni-channel models, that you will be able to deliver certain products through a local retailer. You will be able to deliver certain products which are own brand like Apollo through your own stores. You will be able to deliver certain products through the marketplace, and there will be some that you will decide to deliver directly. So there may be a possibility that this will be the evolution depending on the kind of medicines, the kind of approach that these companies take. To put it very simply, if it was medication for a chronic ailment, then I would like to own that customer. Whether it is the offline pharmacy or the online players, they would like to own that customer because this is going to be guaranteed revenue flow. Approach to selling those medicines may be very different from selling, let's say, something which is one-off. So we've got to think about this a little more deeply as to what the model is. It's not simply either online or offline, or saying that, hey, we will just get everybody in the offline stores to participate in the Ayushman Bharat digital mission and we'll solve the problem. I think we need to think about it a little more carefully. There'll be more players, and the way we think about it has to be very different. The third point I wanted to make was the pressures that offline retailers are facing, there used to be a time when they would actually sell high value products. Now that's all gone to the hospitals. So they're not selling any high value products. They're not selling the high volumes, because that's been taken over by e-commerce and now quick commerce. So you've lost the volume, you've lost the high value. So you're left with stuff that is not really fast moving in the urban areas, at least, or those that are accessible to online commerce. And so that is their real pain point, that they have margins to make on a very limited supply of goods, which don't move very fast. And they're forced to therefore push these products. So the outcome of this, maybe very unintended, is going to be that we're going to see offline retailers push product which otherwise, I won't say not incentivized to push, but they will have less business pressure to push. So I don't know if policymakers are thinking about second order effects of these things, that what are you therefore getting offline pharmacies to do in terms of changed behavior. I think that's an important area. Nobody's writing about it. Nobody's talking about it. Finally, one of the big challenges I have with all of this digital stuff is privacy. And my fear is that this is going to be a real problem in India. To a large extent, the fact that I go to an offline store, assuming that he doesn't know me and I don't know him, accords a level of privacy to my life. I'm going to lose all of that if I'm forced to go online. So to me, it's a real issue. It's particularly so in India because culturally we are not attuned to privacy. We're attuned to gossip. So to me, it's a real challenge. We will see dire consequences of that. And I've spoken about it before while I was critical of the national health stack, is that whatever purchases I'm going to make, or my wife makes, or somebody else makes, will create a data trail. This data will feed into what else the person knows about me, or the online marketplace knows about me. And we've seen very bad consequences of this in the rest of the world. The very famous example is, suddenly a person gets delivered or suggested, recommended baby products, and she's a 13-year-old girl, young girl, and parents look at it and think, is she pregnant? And the consequences of that can be quite dire in our part of the world. Similarly, with abortion, miscarriages, all of those things, largely to those people who are not in a position to say, I don't care. It's going to be a lot more in those kind of situations. So I think these are the few things where I think we need to think through more carefully. It is not as simple as saying online is great, let's get everybody online and let's get Ayushman Bharat digital mission going. We'll give them 500 crores more and everybody will be happy. Just get on with the program. So I have concerns. I don't think just being offline is the solution, but unless these concerns are addressed, we're likely to have second order effects that we're not prepared for.
Great points, both Nirupama and Murali. I just want to add before I hand off to Leena that data privacy, great point you're making. Only thing is the idea of a data privacy law is barely even 4 or 5 years old. So we are so new to this idea. So you rightly flagged it. Now the challenge is to implement this data privacy violations as an end. And we see it happening in our lives daily basis. I think very legit fear. But the solution to me, as I see it, is to implement those data privacy laws with zero tolerance. That's the only way forward, because it'll threaten not just India's our data, but sovereign data is also kind of likely to be challenged. And why would foreign investors come here if they fear loss of data? And we're sorry for the slight segue. Over to you, Leena.
Okay, so I'm going to go into some of the public health and legal issues that e-pharmacies raise. And of course, all of us use e-pharmacies, so you can't really say they're not part of your life. We used it during COVID, we used it for our parents and so on. So one thing I wanted to say is that you cannot equate an e-pharmacy platform with any other platform of e-commerce. You can't have regulation follow e-pharmacies And I think this is where the big lacuna and the big concern on public health is. Okay. Now the question is who benefits? People use words like access and, all of that very easily. What is the definition of access, right? Who benefits from e-pharmacies? It's urban, educated, digitally savvy Indians who benefit from e-pharmacies. They are able to very quickly, generically substitute the cheaper version of the same drug, right? And they have the capacity and the knowledge to do so, both from a technology point of view, but also being able to figure out the generic salt and so on. Remote districts will continue to be served by brick and mortar, And this is a very important point because I work in remote areas and I know that e-pharmacies will just not reach them because it's just not economically feasible for the kind of distance and the kind of quantities people are ordering. Okay. So if anyone is trying to sell this dream that this is going to be out there in the remote areas, I think people really need to do a good feasibility study before they put the name on it, right? I don't think so at this point. District hospital pharmacies should be strengthened so that, Jan Aushadhis that can exist from the government. And why doesn't Jan Aushadhi then adopt the e-platform mode, delivering, for example, at the doorstep of very remote populations, So I think this is one thing I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about quality. I worked on quality for the last 20 years and on substandard medicines. The concern about substandard medicines is the same for brick and mortar and it is the same for e-pharmacies. I'll tell you why. Because in the supply chain, which are the two areas of substandard medicines that enter the supply chain in India? One, where the state licensing agencies are registering medicines which are older, the biopharmaceutical classifications that exist, class 2 and class 4, which require bioequivalence testing. This does not happen. So you have many drugs which actually require bioequivalence testing or, stability data, which are not going through that process because they are with the state licensing agencies. So brick and mortar will buy those medicines, so will e-pharmacies. So the quality about substandard, that this will somehow magically improve quality, we need to be very, very, very careful about that. The second point I wanted to say is this. The government does have an opportunity here because e-pharmacies have big warehouses, right? And they are serving a larger geographical area. And the government can come in and say, well, we want to look at your storage capacity. We need to look at how you're storing, what temperatures you're storing. And one of the things that adds to substandard medicines is the way you store your medicines, the fridges that you have, the cold chains you have. So e-platforms have that kind of money to maintain very good cold chains. They have money to, maintain a temperature controlled warehouse and so on. And I think this is an opportunity that the government should use to regulate not only e-pharmacies, but all pharmacies, but e-pharmacies offer a greater opportunity to the government to look at a larger geographical scope of this. Now, if you look at irrational use, I'll give you an example. I've used e-pharmacies and, my prescription is a year old, I'm asthmatic. And within 10 minutes, my prescription is old, they'll call you and they give you a new prescription. So are they doing that for antibiotics? Will they do that for Mounjaro and Ozempic? The misuse of type 2 diabetes drugs for, lifestyle weight loss, And, Eli Lilly has been heavily, pushing its drug. Will it push it out through the e-pharmacies where you can just simply say, this is my weight. The next thing you have a prescription for Mounjaro or Ozempic. And, irrational use can exist both in brick and mortar and can exist in e-pharmacies. Again, the government needs to go in and figure out how prescriptions will be maintained and why are e-pharmacies now having doctors on call who just fill your prescriptions, without even seeing the patient physically. So this is a major, major concern that I had. Now, if you look at on access, it's not that e-pharmacy do away with out-of-pocket expenses. A poor person pays for brick and mortar and cannot afford it and pays for even if manages to get onto an e-pharmacy platform, will pay for it. So the public health system needs to strengthen the availability of medicines free of cost in its own district and other pharmacies, PHCs and so on. So out-of-pocket expenses will not disappear. So I think people have to be careful that this will not magically deal with access. And I wanted to say is that what Murali said is really important. Whatever time the government is taking on data protection laws, I think when it comes to medical data, when you're HIV positive, when you have cancer, when you have, chronic diseases, which are, sensitive from a society point of view and stigma point of view. Now that data exists with someone else, the brick and mortar pharmacy is not going to, photocopy your prescription and keep it with them. Well, e-pharmacies have all of the digital record. So I think this area of data protection is more priority because it is confidential medical data. Now, why I'm saying it, anyone who's bought a property in NCR gets about 10 calls, or even looked at a property in NCR gets 10 calls because everyone's releasing your data to everybody. So you can imagine if the e-pharmacies, there's a data leak or decides to, tie up with some insurance company and share the data. I think, when it comes to confidential medical data, e-pharmacies, regulations cannot follow e-pharmacies. E-pharmacies have to follow regulations. And this is the biggest gap. The government should call for a consultation, ask people to speak on access, public health, e-commerce, all the different areas they need to frame regulations because they are here to stay. And this is what I wanted to make a very important point. But the last point I wanted to say, brick and mortar will serve a larger part of Indians who are not digitally savvy and are poor and are living in rural and very remote districts of India. And that regulation we've been calling for ages, So this is something that we really need for both sides of pharmacies. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Leena. Just to add a little anecdotal information to you, I'm sure you've also seen it. I was not aware of Blinkit till my household help. He is very adept at this, and he told me, I was struggling to get something immediately. So I said, "Oh, bahar jana hoga." So he said, "Kyun?" So I said, "Oh, Amazon mein bahut time." He said, "Blinkit." I had no idea what Blinkit was. So I was amazed at his dexterity. He ordered from his app, and then now I am hooked to Blinkit. So I think we underestimate the tech capability of those who are not like us. So just anecdotal. I don't know is any trend that I'm putting before you. Just an anecdotal. Anyway, the three of you have, meaning some of you have, at least Nirupama, did highlight the positives of e-pharmacies. But largely, all three of you have flagged very serious concerns on e-pharmacies. So I want to turn this back to all three of you in the same order to come up with solutions to the challenges that you have offered. Over to you, Nirupama. I think you're on mute, Nirupama.
Yeah,
good.
Solutions. That's going to be difficult just off the top of my head. But I can't obviously give specific solutions at this. But I think what is required is what I would like to talk about is maybe in terms of how we go about getting to those solutions. I think the first thing is to acknowledge that whether it's offline or online, you need to have regulatory parity. Somewhere that was something we missed out on when we started to regulate e-commerce. There's huge difference at regulatory arbitrage between online and offline platforms. And I think with something like pharmacies, we can't have that. So much to Leena's point, where she's talking about, getting in the regulations in place because it's easier now, maybe with the warehouses that your e-pharmacies have in terms of temperature control, what needs to be done. I think that kind of parity for e-commerce, e-pharmacies and your regular pharmacies, there needs to be some level of parity. But the larger problem is not actually in terms of creating the regulations. I think it's the question of seeing how do you enforce them. Enforcement, especially with e-pharmacies, much like how you want to enforce certain things with your kirana stores, maybe your traditional retail, they are spread across. So in which case, what do you do? How do you even keep track to see whether those kind of regulations, particularly in terms of how you store, at what temperature you need to store, where do you store, how are they met? In which case, you then have to look at it at two levels, where you're regulating warehouses which actually store your medicines versus the retail outlets that store your medicines, because ultimately there will be, especially for offline, there will be that difference in layer there. So are we looking at that? The second thing I think which is important also to note is in terms of how we are allowing for bundling of services to happen. Because one of the other advantages that one is talking about when it comes to e-pharmacies is a possibility where you could bundle services together. So whether it's in terms of diagnostics, and I'm keeping the privacy issue aside because the privacy issue is very, very important and it is a serious concern, especially because medical data is very, very sensitive. But keeping that aside, and if you're just looking at it in terms of bundling, so how does that work? Are we saying e-pharmacies will have their own in-house doctors who will then kind of, because that is part of the discussion that I've seen, where they will then kind of do the consultations, issue prescriptions, in which case, do we know what the qualifications of such doctors are? And to your, point earlier, Anil, in terms of the fact that whether we have even pharmacists available or not, growing up, my mohalla clinic or equivalent family doctor had this person known as a compounder. I don't know how many of us are even aware, but he was the pharmacist in those clinics who used to literally sit there and mix compounds and make your medicines then and there. That I think has disappeared completely. I haven't seen one and I don't know when, but it was basically that which then got replaced. And today, if I even go to some of the pharmacies, you have all of them wearing the lab coats. So, from even an advertising point of view, it kind of gives you the idea that they're a doctor or a pharmacist, but they're neither, because I've literally asked them, have you studied this? Casually, out of curiosity, and most of them haven't. So is it misleading? So regulations, when we look at it in that sense, and what kind of solutions, to what level do we want to regulate, to what micro detail do we want to regulate, and how are we going to be ensuring? Now, the thing with online platforms, whether it's e-pharmacies or anything, what is it that we're saying? We're saying that the difference is it's easier to audit because there is a trail which can be easily accessible over your offline shops. That's pretty much the simple part of it. But that also has invariably resulted in over-regulation of your online platforms because it's easy, and therefore not as strict or stringent implementation or even execution at the offline level, which is where your disparities get created. So I think before we jump to solution, I think the first question we need to ask is what level of parity can we expect for both? So when you're looking at privacy laws, the privacy laws are sacrosanct, irrespective of somebody is holding, the data physically or whether it's held digitally. The breaches in digital, probably more. And while we think that your offline, person is not going to be photocopying and sending it, there's no regulation. I mean, would the regulations of privacy should apply there. So if I find that my pharmacist is photocopying my bills and my bill orders and giving it to somebody, they must be subject to the same kind of penalties and problems that one would otherwise. Ideally speaking, philosophically speaking, that parity needs to be there. So I think the first order of business before we find the solutions, and they will have to come out, is at what level are we willing to maintain that parity in regulation so that you don't actually disadvantage the online platform over the offline only because they're easier to kind of audit, so to speak, and therefore subject to more regulation. Equal regulation, great, but more regulation on online just because you can track them better, you can audit them better, kind of defeats the entire purpose, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupama. I just want to add another vanishing tribe in the medical architecture is the GP. I don't know how many of you have a GP. I still have one, but he's on his last legs, and I don't know who I'll go to after this. So it's a genuine problem you have flagged. Over to you, Murali.
I think I'm generally in agreement that if we start regulating each of them separately, we will end up in a situation where we don't really have a policy view on anything. So just because the online retailers are easier to monitor, are easier to regulate, and therefore we should regulate them less or regulate them as poorly as we do the offline retailers, I think is a difficult argument. If at all, it should be that the online retailers will raise the standard, will be easier to monitor, and therefore will be more credible, and that will be their calling card. And we've seen that with online retailing generally, that you have assured or guaranteed quality on several online retailers. So they kind of, in a sense, assure you that they have taken some effort to identify the product, identify the source, understand provenance, and therefore you're more likely to get a product that you think you're buying. And the consequences of failure are that you will get an instant refund. So there are some benefits to it. And I think we'd rather focus on them and say the reason to use online retailers to get everybody to that standard and get the regulation to help with that. Rather than say that it's difficult to audit offline retailers, offline distributors. The warehouses that I've seen are horrendous in the past, and therefore, they're difficult to monitor, and therefore we'll go after these big guys. So I'm not really sure if you want to go down that path. Bundling, again, is a big problem for me. It's quite common. I don't use online retailers for medical supplies, but I've done a little bit of research on it. And the kind of crap that they put out there to sell you is just very, very scary. So my fear is that they are trying to sell more because they have your attention at a particular point in time. So you'll end up buying a whole lot of stuff that at least potentially is useless and in many cases quite harmful. So bundling to me is a real issue. And I think in terms of policy, you're unlikely to see bundling in an offline store. Although we're seeing a little more of it now when they're trying to sell you multivitamins, this, that, and the other. But I see that threat to be a lot more in the online marketplace. They have to try and sell you a lot more stuff. So to me, bundling is a real issue. It's a problem that is much more likely to be of a larger scale in online stores than it is to be in an offline store. You mentioned the death of a compounder, but in the old days, we had chemists and druggists. People put that board up without knowing what it means. And that used to be the person who would actually mix the portion that was written up in a prescription and hand you a bottle or a sachet of powders and liquids to consume. Now, that was meant to be the role of the pharmacist in the pharmacy store today. They're meant to understand what it is that is being dispensed. I wrote a paper last year in the Lancet on the risk of look-alike and sound-alike drugs. There are many drugs which are trademarked, unfortunately, and we found several instances where the same trademark is used for two very, very different drugs. One for psychotic illnesses with a trademark, and the same trademark used for cancer drugs. So there is a real risk that we could get this very, very wrong. We don't track it in India, so the risk of prescription errors and dispensing errors is really, really high. Except that since we don't know how to track it, we don't track it, and so we don't have good data on it. All we have is anecdotal data from doctors in hospitals, especially government hospitals, where they look at these things and people come back and say, I took this drug and it didn't get better. And then you look at it and say, it's the same brand name, but it's the wrong drug. Given that we don't have good pharmacists in the drugstores doing this exercise, there is a chance, there is a good opportunity for the online retailers to say, we can track this, we can come up with a way to mitigate against it. We understand combinations that should not be taken, and therefore we can provide a better service to the patient and general health if we are able to do it. So there are uses of data that I understand that are valuable, and that might be a feature that needs to be incorporated. I don't know how many remember that there was once, before COVID, there was a Digital Information Security in Healthcare Act. It was called DISHA. Miraculously, it just died. And they assumed that it will all get captured by the Data Protection Act. Now, we have neither DISHA nor data protection today. So to the extent that we could have had a chance to fix privacy by design in these e-commerce on the online pharmacies, we should have done it when they were still quite nascent. And for all of you who have forgotten, online pharmacies have existed for more than 10 years. So it's 2015, it's not a new phenomenon. So to now come back and say that, hey, security is an issue, privacy is an issue, we knew all of this then. And the government chose not to act on any of this. So to say that, what is the policy we should come out? I think there were many ideas in government 10 years ago. The government's chosen not to do it. Even on the 1st of August in Parliament, the minister said that they will look at the 2018 e-pharmacy, online pharmacy regulations, when in fact there is an act that they're proposing now in 2025, which they say will be the new Drugs Act. It was a 2022 draft. So even within government, we're getting very mixed signals. Is the minister talking about the 2018 regulations? Is he talking about the 2022 revised legislation that they're proposing to bring in? There is a new clinical trials rules that they're claiming that they're going to bring in that came out in the news yesterday. So to suggest that we will have an alternative is very difficult because we don't know where the government stands on any of these things. The last point I wanted to make was, we've seen what's happened to crypto. We've seen what's happened to real money gaming. Now, is there a risk that something similar will happen here? I fear not. Plainly because the players that are in this market are the big guys. We're talking about Reliance, Tata's, Apollo in this market. So they seem to be quite happy with the level of regulation that's happening at the moment. And I don't think they are in any way pushing for better regulation of online pharmacies. So we should be understanding and vigilant about who the players are, what the incentives are, what the levers are in business and in government. So to think that if we have better regulation, we will have more investment, I think that's being a bit too naive. Currently, that business is thriving with the current state of regulation. And to think that they have an incentive to get better regulation, I think is a bit being a bit too naive. So I wouldn't get too excited by new regulations in any form anytime soon. Much as we need it, we'll need to have very difficult discussions. And I don't think there is an environment for those difficult discussions today. I'll stop now.
Thank you, Murali. Over to you, Leena.
Okay. So I would concentrate on, what future regulations should look at, and I don't like comparing apples and oranges in terms of regulation. I'm a lawyer. I don't believe treating everything the same way leads to inequality. In fact, it leads to inequality. So I'll just come through the three major legal points that we have. Is basically the government needs to plug the data protection gap that exists with e-pharmacies. Just because the threat of our data being leaked, or our medical status being leaked, or our data being shared with one of the employees who's disgruntled and has gone to another e-platform is huge, right? While in a kirana store, they might know your status, they may reveal it, and of course, we are protecting that through different public health laws. We could be stronger on it, yes, but the danger of digital leakage of data is far, far greater. The second thing I wanted to say is this, that I just spoke about Ozempic and Mounjaro, the GLP-1s, which are meant for type 2 diabetes and certain kinds of obesity thresholds, which is a classical example of what e-pharmacies would do. And we've seen that in the UK, we've seen that in the US, which is where people who want that drug to lose weight before a wedding or so on, you could go online, get a prescription. This could happen for antibiotics, it could happen for... So the scope of the manner in which prescriptions are being, given out by e-platforms needs to be regulated. The same concerns exist when a 3-year-old prescription is, trotted out at, a brick and mortar, and you pick up your medicines without even realizing that the prescription is long expired or being used for another patient. So yes, you can actually use this as an opportunity to regulate both brick and mortar as well as in pharmacy. I really wanted to highlight that, e-pharmacies will not take away the access gap. The government still need to provide treatments for diabetes and chronic diseases along with communicable diseases through the public healthcare system and reduce out-of-pocket expenditures, and India has some of the highest rates of that. So I just wanted to highlight that. And lastly, I think someone in the chat said foreign policy. I think the biggest concern for India globally has been the concern about Indian medicines that were exported through state licensing agency licenses, and what happened as a public health threat as well as to individual health, is that unless you actually do very important reforms in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, which take the older and new medicines at the same level and ensure that any new manufacturer complies with what we require for stability or bioequivalence. If the drug requires a biowaiver, you get a biowaiver. If you need to do bioequivalence study, you do it. You get the stability data out there. You don't just state, I've done stability studies. So I think that would serve India really well, because India is the pharmacy, where everyone turns for GLP-1s to HIV meds today. So I think from a regulation point of view, we need to address the issue of substandard medicines. We need to address the fact that, irrational prescriptions will exist with e-pharmacies. We need to do data protection, and we have to remove the illusion that this will solve access problems. It will not solve access problems. Indeed, it is. And, I'm not pro or anti, because we all use technology in different ways, and I'm pro-choice in that sense. If my older parents benefit from me delivering medicines at their doorstep, I think people are entitled to do that. At the same time, regulation is really very key going forward. And if this conversation by cuts, and we can put together the points for looking at the regulations that are already being put together, and whether those are reflected in it, would be very, I think, I'm a positive person, and I think there's always scope for better regulations and reforms at any level of public health. Yeah, thanks.
Before we proceed to the next round, I was just curious if any one of you have a thought on what I just want to make an observation about. I mean, isn't all the challenges that all three of you have mentioned accrue from a larger capacity issue of this country? The rule of law, particularly the rule of law, we can see it as, in our daily lives, as we see it on the road, wrong side driving, all kinds of violations. There's a serious, neglect or respect to the rule of law. The other is trust quotient. The trust quotient is so low in this country, but thanks to e-commerce, I see a lot of that trust quotient bridged to a degree, in the sense like I'll buy an expensive item and expect it to be delivered. 99% it is delivered. And there is a backup mechanism how you can work around this for most e-tail transactions. So curious if any of you have thoughts that a lot of this can get fixed, if we fix the larger challenge.
No, see, I just wanted to simply say this, that, India has two major challenges before it on public health. And, you can't discount the kind of healthcare system India has actually built, because I've looked at other countries and then, just looked at India. India does have public health infrastructure. Human resources are a huge issue. But in the key area where Brazil and Thailand, for example, are ahead of India, are making sure that the medicines that are in the essential medicine list are available free of cost to patients. Or, you can have the Thai system, a baht a year or baht a month, and building a universal public healthcare system. And this is where the entire private sector comes in India. Anil, we can't say that the private sector is not a product of gaps in a public healthcare system. So, I mean, as we go forward strengthening the public healthcare system, you will see a less and less dependence on the private healthcare system, And the second point I wanted to say is this: it depends upon how you used technology. The government has a great opportunity when we're talking about digital. You're actually talking about technology, and then this is where I think the whole issue of how you deliver medicines needs to be separated out. You may use a technology tool, but at the same time, access cannot be just solely determined by the delivery system. So I think people have to be, as I said, a little more practical about the limitations of this e-platform thing. And as to having any sympathies for why should we not do the brick and mortar and why should we not do the e-pharmacy? E-pharmacies are big corporations. We've had the worst human rights violations from the big corporations. I think millions of people. It's not a small geographical area, one brick and mortar going rogue with relabeling expired medicines and taking them out. We need strong regulations because you're dealing with corporations who have massive outreach across the country. And they have the capital to fix those problems, right? So I think, I have a completely different take as on apples and oranges. And I think if more and more people are turning to e-platforms, the government has a responsibility to regulate better and not do a catch-up on it. But
I think,
great work can that be done on regulations, yeah.
I think there is an opportunity for us to use technology much better, even for public health. If you look at how states procure and how states actually provide medicines and supplies to their own hospitals, to patients free of cost or at subsidized rates, that is a complete disaster. The model that's held up is Tamil Nadu, which now everybody else seems to have copied because the World Bank said it's a great idea. But even there is very poor procurement. I have a paper published on how badly it's procured, how stockouts happen, what are the consequences of stockouts, the difficulty of actually doing substitutions for basic things like blood pressure and diabetes. So there is a lot that can be done with technology in the public healthcare system. So if we want to actually use technology much better, we can start off by using it in the place where it matters the most, which is government procurement, public health services, the government hospitals, the state medical services corporations. All of those can actually use the benefits of better technology. They can procure better, they can have better supply chains. If you see some of the warehouses where these medicines are supplied, who supplies those medicines, how they are kept in the government warehouses, I mean, that is shocking. So can we use technology better? Yes. Can we use it first for public health? Much easier to do. It is going to save money. In a paper I wrote, we estimate that it will be more than 50% if government does better procurement just on drugs, and it could be much higher. We will have better access, which means those drugs will actually be available where people need them. We will not have stockouts. We will have better quality and we'll have lower price. So the way to think about this is to say, can we have a credible public healthcare system? And can we build it using the technology that we already have? That I think should be the first priority of government. Whether you want to fight with big corporates or not can be left for another day. And if you really want to fight, this is the place to fight. We will provide a better alternative, which is what happens in developed nations, that the public healthcare system is so good that there is no real need to go to a private healthcare service provider. I lived 10 years in the UK. I can afford to have private healthcare, but there's really no reason to go to a private hospital. And the private hospitals there are really government hospitals with one floor which has a private wing, where the difference really is some baby pictures or roses or things like that. The doctors are the same, the drugs are the same, the services are the same, the operation theater is the same, the supplies they use are the same. So really, if we want to think about better healthcare delivery, we can do all of that with government being a little more proactive. And for everybody who says, sorry, we don't have the money, ESI has 12 lakh crores, 12.5 lakh crores as surplus. And that's collected from the poorest worker in the organized sector who doesn't get any healthcare. So, if you want to fix, there are many things the government can fix. I would suggest we start there rather than, think about these little differences that we can find between online pharmacies and retailers. We want to improve public healthcare. There are bigger problems to solve, and we have the money to solve it.
if I can also come in very quickly. See, I think personally, I'm kind of semi in agreement with both of them, and on a couple of things I'm not in agreement with. So the first thing is India will always have larger issues to solve. Whether it's public health, whether it's anything else, there are always going to be a lot of the larger issues that need to be solved. And that's going to be an ongoing process, in part because size of the country, population, scale is always something we're going to have to grapple with. Irrespective of what we do, how great regulations are, whichever way, the larger issues are going to persist. And it's going, I don't know how easily they will ever, whether they will even ever disappear is a debatable conversation. So I come from this line of thought saying that just because there are larger issues to deal with, doesn't mean we don't deal with the other issues that also exist. So I'm somebody who says you need to parallel process and work, because there are the larger issues, they need the attention, they need to be addressed. And I agree completely with Murali where he says that when you have the funds available, you need to use technology to set your public health system right. We need to work on that. I absolutely agree. But what I don't agree with is to say just because those are there, should we be concerning ourselves with regulatory parity in terms of, e-commerce and traditional and all of that? I think, yes, that also needs it, because look, at the end of the day, if you look at philosophy of regulation, and there's lots been written in terms of prudential, microprudential, macroprudential versus, whether what you do, ultimately, what are you looking at? See, when you're looking at regulations, you want to make sure that markets grow in a fair manner, and you want to make sure that at the end, the consumer is protected. Now, if I have a consumer base, whether it is 2 to 3% of market share as it was in 2019 for online pharmacies, or whether it is 44%, whatever it may be, but that group of consumers who are buying from online pharmacies have the right to expect quality and have the right to know that what they are buying is correct, worth it, good, and there is a certain amount of regulation that is there. The question is never about over-regulation, under-regulation in itself. I don't think, and I don't know if I was misunderstood in that sense, but it's not about, when I say over-regulation of e-pharmacies, I mean in comparison to offline. Look, the risks are more or less the same. If you are going by risks, certain risks, obviously e-pharmacies are more prone to than your offline. So for example, data leakages, yes. So that's where you have differentiated, but the principle in terms of what risk you're regulating remains the same. So to that extent, you need to have regulatory parity, at least in terms of the principles that you're regulating. You can't say that I will regulate certain aspects for e-commerce, e-pharmacies, but I will let it slide for your offline. You can't. I don't think that's a good approach. That's my opinion. And I think we have kind of let that happen for other sectors. And I don't think that's a sensible approach. And I think at the end of the day, which is why I keep talking about parity. Second thing, in terms of access, I mean, to Leena's point, I agree. I don't think e-commerce is going to be, e-pharmacies is going to be a solution to, suddenly make everything easy and transparent. But I also believe that if you look at basically what e-commerce has done, and if you look at the reach, right, it has actually improved a lot of logistics. So a lot of time logistics hasn't worked because there is no scale. Now, if you look at India Post alone, which has probably the last mile connectivity like most others don't, when e-commerce first started, and I'm talking now about at least 7-8 years back, 34% of their business actually came from e-commerce orders. That was then. Today, it's a lot more, and today you have other kinds of delivery, logistics players that have entered the market. Now, whether so if I can sit here and order and make sure that it gets delivered somewhere where otherwise I don't have access to medicine. So the fact of the matter is, this doesn't mean that it's an excuse to not stock your medicines in certain places. That's not the point. Just because it's available online doesn't mean you kind of let the ball down on your offline pharmacies, or you don't stock them well, or you don't make sure that they're well equipped to deal with the demand there. That's not it. But anecdotally, let me give you 2 examples. And especially in today's day and age, I sit here in Delhi. My grandmother is in Chennai in an assisted living. Now, when I want to order medicines for her, right, either I have to rely on somebody going out and buying, right, which is what we're doing today, But if I had an option for e-pharmacy, especially if something where I can link it to her physician, etc., it does make my life a little simple because I can track what is happening. Now, when I say access, it also means access in that sense, where people cannot step out because of whatever their reasons are, can they access medicine? So access transcends just urban, urban and rural. It transcends remote versus what is there. There is an access issue that it does solve for, even if it's very small, but it does bring in that. And I think that's the point. The first thing I think all of us agree on, and I'm sure we all do, is that e-pharmacies is not a magic wand that suddenly, if it is introduced, it's going to solve existing problems or it's going to deal with all of the other issues that exist either in offline or with public health. I don't think so. But because it is there, and as Murali rightly said, it's not a new phenomenon, it's been there for a while. The risks that are there are becoming more and more evident. Whether we like it or not, while we deal with the larger issues, we have to kind of look at these as well, and it needs to be regulated in the interest of the fact that you have to protect the consumer who's using it. For me, it boils down to that at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupama. I think we are just entering we had another round, but I see a lot of questions which are popping up on the chat mode. Can we jump to the questions, and can you, three of you, see them, or do I read them out? So the first question is from Puru Singh. It's directed at Murali and Nirupama. I think you partially answered it, but in case, Leena, you want to jump in, feel free to do so. So I see Murali is not on screen. Nirupama is... You're there, Murali? Okay. Murali, you did answer this in part during our conversations, but would you like to take another crack at it?
This is the one on whether we should have separate regulatory bodies. Is that the question?
No, the first one, Puru Singh, what would be the priority for policymakers in the next 2-3 years to build up?
So my answer was, the ecosystem for online commerce seems to be working quite well. There are powers at play which like the status quo, as I said, and therefore, given our limited state capacity, I would say, let's focus on what Leena and I care a lot more about, which is public health, access to medicines for those who are the 80 crores people in this country. I would focus on that. So if policymakers are listening, let's focus on that. Online commerce will take care of itself. They do pretty well. They have the money, they have the influence, they have the ear of government. So, if policymakers want to hear something outside of their little ivory towers, then it would be this, that let's focus on public health. There is plenty to be done. For example, just rationalization of the formulary across states, which is, can states decide that they're going to sell the same medicines for the same diseases to their people? It's a very simple thing to do, but we don't do it. For example, the number of drugs to treat diabetes in each state varies. There's no good reason for it other than some politicians on the take, or a group of them are on the take. Similarly, for each of these therapy areas, there are people in some states who will get a medicine, and that same medicine is not available to people in other states. It's just unfair. We're all Indians. We should be able to get the same medicine irrespective of where we are for the same diseases. So there are lots of these very fundamental issues that we can fix. They will have incredible benefit. We can focus on those, not to take away from the topic, but we use online retailers to perhaps help us with supply chain rationalization and things like that, and use those facilities which they have. But those are the big policy issues. I'm not so fussed, apart from the privacy and other issues that we've discussed, that we should be spending a lot of time thinking and consulting on online pharmacies. They're big enough; they can take care of themselves.
Any quick thoughts? Yeah.
Yes. I think some of it already answered on whether you need to regulate or not. But more pointed question, I think there were two as part of that, is one or two things what is the focus over the next 2 to 3 years. I think the first point of business is you need to allow for at least regulation on entry of who these guys are. I think that's what one of the draft rules was also. So you need to register yourself. You need to go through a certain kind of rigorous KYC, not just in terms of basic know your customer, in terms of the business, but at least other parameters to enter your e-pharma business. Because if you don't have that, and to Murali's point, it's great that who's there, the people who are there today are the larger guys, but what prevents anybody else from entering? So I think at least that needs to be mandated, spread, so that you know that who's allowed and who's not to enter this market. And to be honest, I'm not sure if that's already there in other form. It's coming. Okay, so great. If that's coming, then at least. Sorry?
To retail any medicines, you need a drug license. It's all there. If you want to sell medicines, you need a retail. You need a distribution as well as a retail drug license from the Drug Regulatory Authority.
So if you
that already exists, like all of these regulations already exist,
No, so fair enough. I'm saying, but if you are starting something, look, regulations exist, yes, but if you are an online platform and if you're just starting something, many of fly-by-night operators who may just begin, is there a way of tracking?
The moment you store medicines anywhere,
exactly,
the drug inspector will be at your doorstep, Nirupama. So it doesn't matter, you are an e-platform, wherever you're sourcing your drugs, that place will be covered by a drug license, and there's very rigorous paperwork to get a drug license. So already covered by the law, actually, to be very honest.
No, fair enough. I think I'm glad if that happens.
And sorry, and you can't even buy. So the challenge is that nobody will sell you. So you can't set up shop because the distributor will not sell you if you don't have a license. The distributor himself or itself is licensed. So, which is why I said that the ecosystem is working quite fine, even if new players come in, and there were 20 online pharmacy players just before COVID. I don't know how many are left now, but notices were issued by the drug controller to 20 online players in that market. In I think 2018 or so, soon after that Delhi High Court interim order was issued. So, there are enough players. There is regulation for them. It was on the basis of this understanding that the interim orders were vacated, including in the Madras High Court, where the division bench said very clearly that they are complying with it. It is the duty of the drug controller to ensure that they are complying with it. And so long as there's compliance, in terms of the Drugs Act, which applies both online and offline retailers, they should not be held to a higher standard and required to do something more, because we don't know what that something more is. So we've heard this from two courts, from the Delhi High Court and from the Madras High Court. PIL was dismissed by the Bombay High Court in 2019, which said we should ban online pharmacies. So currently there is no threat to the business of online pharmacies due to whatever it is, this lack of regulations.
Okay, so I get where I don't think there's ever that kind of issue. But having said that, see, I'll tell you where my concern usually comes from. If you look at it, because there has been a lot of comments that come from your offline e-pharmacies, your offline pharmacies, in terms of competition, in terms of what happens and regulations. See, I'm with you. If currently these regulations exist, whether there's a question of, so there are two things, right? When we talk of regulation, one is, do they need to be regulated? And the second is, do they need more regulation? Now, from what I understand, obviously existing laws work. So they're already regulated. The question is, do you need more regulations? That's where we need to look at what areas require extra regulation. And I think one or two of that is, of course, your privacy laws which exist. Now, my point is also, while we're looking at those and to see how the market shifts, etc., I want to only make sure, and I would kind of flag off that you can't, and as you rightly said, you can't keep asking for extra and extra and extra, because at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, and however the competition affects your offline retailers, in an effort to protect your offline pharmacies, because this has happened in e-commerce per se, you add additional regulatory requirements on your online platforms because you think that kind of balances out and creates a level playing field. That has happened in other areas. I think that's what I'm more concerned about, which I would want to flag off and say, I hope that doesn't happen. The second is, I think, look, for any kind of regulatory system in India, especially for sensitive sectors, I always think a three-tiered structure always works. So one is you need to have draft regulations, regulations, which is there. The second tier is usually a regulator, and the third is self-regulation. So self-regulation, I think Mr. Chattopadhyay or I think even Ujjwal said that Picky already has self-regulation. They've done something and industry is coming out with that, and that's anyway industry-driven. The regulations, which is the first tier, is already there. And to also answer the question, do we need a separate regulator? At this point, I don't think we need a separate regulator. I think you have existing frameworks and existing regulators who can take on this as well and do it. So I think in that sense, we are fairly good where we are. I don't think we need to add any more to it in terms of what we have, and then just allow things to function as it is till any new risks probably come up or we identify. But till then, if we're good to go, we're good to go.
Thank you. The next two, one is a question, one is a comment. The question Leena actually addressed in her opening remarks, and she answered it. The comment is exactly what all three of you just discussed, a regulatory nightmare that has to be resolved. So I think we're running out of time, though we are just getting warmed up. I would love for this to go for another hour, because especially for a journalist like me, huge learnings from the three of you. And I think we are all agreed on one thing, that all Indians need access to affordable and safe healthcare. E-pharmacies is one of the platforms that can deliver. All we need is the regulation, but that's not isolated only to them. It extends to even the offline pharmacies. So it's a delicate situation, has to be addressed, I think, with soft touch, not the hard touch that we are used to in regulation. So I will thank you all. Thank Leena, Nirupama, and Murali for your erudite interventions and guidance today. And and thank you, audience, for so patiently being part of this conversation. And thank you for your questions. I'll hand off to Ujjwal. Ujjwal, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anil. Thank you for joining despite some busy schedule. And really, we had a very, very lively and as you said, as a learner, I was also keen to kind of follow it for another hour. So yes, but I think some points have come for further studies. Largely, the broad regulations are there. Perhaps the e-pharmacy people need not worry about that. But from consumers' perspective, if regulations, particularly for the irrational prescription and sale of substandard drugs come, and that applies also to the offline. But I mean, since a scale is high, can be high on the online, it will be it will engender more trust among patients and consumers, and that will help it propagate further. One thing was consensus that e-pharmacy is going to stay because consumers are liking it. There is a number of consumers in India which are using that, and they need that e-pharmacy for access to medicines and other healthcare services, particularly for their either parents or those who can, kind of the working people who husband and wife are working in other town and parents are in other towns, like even I am of that bracket. So it is going to stay. So thank you all. This was just a beginning. We will do a report of this, and we'll send the report to all participants and you, and we'll familiarize with it. We also carve out certain research and future research and advocacy agenda, and let's work as a group. So I invite you all to work as a group to take this forward. And so thank you panelists, thank you moderator, and thank you the participants. Thank you. See you. Bye.
Thank you, Nirupama and Murali and Ujjwal, and thank you for that. Bye.
Thank you, Leena. Good to see you.
Bye.